It's time for a paddling! Hey folks, I couldn't resist that. Sorry for the weird opening. I'm Matt Easton of Scholar Gladiator, and today we're going to be looking at an obscure weapon in my Obscure Weapons playlist. If you haven't checked that playlist out already, then please do. Now this, as you can see, looks somewhat like a paddle or an oar, and it's debatable whether that's where it originated or not. But what is this? This is from the Solomon Islands, and this is a Solomon Islands war club. Where the hell are the Solomon Islands? Some of you will be asking. Well, some of you will probably know very well. It's relatively close to Papua New Guinea, and I suppose not a crazy distance away from Australia. So we're looking at this series of islands. Obviously Papua New Guinea is pretty damn big, but this series of islands which come down and have related populations on them. So clearly, long ago, far in prehistory, in the mists of time, people island hopped, probably using canoes, perhaps sailing vessels. It's much debated, but they basically island hopped and they ended up populating these islands down there. Now, the Solomon Islands, as well as the other islands in this part of the world, are famous, shall we say, anthropologically in arms and armour terms, for their war clubs. Now, these weren't the only weapons they had. You'll notice this is completely wood, and we'll talk about that in a second. But they also used javelins, for example. They used forms of bow as well. So, the primary weapons, I think we can say, for warfare at this time on the Solomon Islands, across the centuries on the Solomon Islands, up until really relatively quite recently in modern history, were spears thrown and arrows shot. And so they were the primary weapons. However, kind of more glamorous than that, and what get a lot of attention from both arms and armour aficionados like me, but also people who collect tribal art, for example, are war clubs. And the reason for that is because war clubs in a lot of these places, and we could also look at places like Fiji, down to New Zealand, up to Papua New Guinea, as I mentioned, and so on and so forth. The war clubs are all quite distinctive and quite artistic. So they're not simply a stick to whack someone with, but I will be talking about that in a second. They're not just a stick to whack someone with, they also have artistic expression on them and are connected to things such as tribal groupings, so sort of ethnicity, you could say, to an extent, cultural practices, artistic expression, and ceremonial purposes as well. So, if we go to just the Solomon Islands, I'm not going to expand this to looking across the whole region, but if we just look at the Solomon Islands, we will see that despite the fact that you might think it's a relatively, compared to world culture, isolated place and fairly insular, they actually have quite a great variety of war clubs just from the Solomon Islands. I mean, I'm not even talking about Fiji or New Zealand or Papua New Guinea. If we just look at the Solomon Islands, you actually get a range of war clubs, and this is one of the types. This is actually one of the more common types that you actually find in the Solomon Islands, and clearly different of those clubs have different advantages and disadvantages based on their different shapes. Some of them have different aspects of use. This, as I say, is a relatively simple and straightforward and relatively popular and common one. Now, often in weapon design we find things that are, the more unusual they are, it's because they weren't necessarily so universally practical. They had a specific use, they were adapted for a specific context and type of environment. Something as simple as a straight hitting stick, paddle-like, is kind of more universal, and therefore it's not surprising that this should be more common. Now, did this evolve from a paddle? I think it's quite likely yes. Now, there are parts of the world where the paddle and the war club can be the same thing. You do get types of paddle which are literally made to be used as a paddle and a weapon. I don't believe this is the case in the Solomon Islands, at least with this specific example. This wouldn't make a fantastic paddle, essentially. It's a little bit too thick, probably a little bit too heavy, thicker than it needs to be, and the blade of it, if we call it that, is could be flatter for a paddle and could be wider as well and more kind of spatulate and swollen. So if you were using this as a paddle, yes, you probably could do it, but it wouldn't be the world's most efficient paddle. You could make a better paddle. This is actually better catered to actually whacking people really, really hard with, and in some cases stabbing. Now, I actually took this to my HEMA club on the last Tuesday night, and people had some fun swinging it around because it is a very, very pleasing piece of wood. To give you some stats, it's just over 130 centimeters long and weighs just over 1100, so 1100 grams. So it's fairly weighty for a piece of wood of this size, and it's got a fairly good length to it. It's about the same length as a medieval longsword. It's got a good reach, or a Dane axe, something like that. Maybe not quite as long as a Dane axe, but a longsword. And it is top heavy. If we look at the shape of it, it tapers all the way up to, let's call it the hitting end, although you will notice that whilst this is swollen and edged, and it is really like a wooden blade, you imagine a culture where there's no metal, and things like shark's teeth and bits of stone and things like this might be used. But if you are having primarily wooden weapons, this is actually a very focused edge. Now, I'm not going to say it's going to cut per se, but it will split in the same way that something like a wood splitting axe would. So that received a blow into any of your limbs or your head would have quite a devastating effect because it concentrates a lot of inertia into a very small surface area. So it does have a cleaving effect, even if it's not sharp to the touch per se. And people were really surprised by this object, because the first thing, pretty much the universal reaction when they picked it up, they were like, whoa, they were like, that's a really nice stick. I really want to hit things with that. And it really does. It really makes you want to swing it around and hit. It's got great indexing because you've got this sort of lozenge cross section here. So it's got these edges and it's quite flat. As soon as you put it into your hand, unlike a normal round stick, which you might sort of smack with, you absolutely feel the edge alignment with this. So it's really going to assist in smashing that swollen edged tip into whatever you want to hit with it. Interestingly, could you hit with the flat? You could do, and I made a joke, a bad joke, that you could set it to stun by turning it this way. And indeed, you could frying pan someone in the head with the flat of it, but it's rather uncomfortable to hold the weapon this way because this orientation of the end that you're going to be predominantly holding is quite wide and quite flat. So as soon as you put it this way round, it's extremely uncomfortable to use. So the object, as is often the case with archaeology and anthropology, the object kind of tells you how it wants to be used, and it definitely wants to be used like this. But I mentioned that, that's the obvious use of it. Okay, clearly these things are predominantly two-handed. Could you use it one-handed? Just about, maybe, but it's very cumbersome one-handed. And I think anybody using one against you two-handed would completely steamroll you. So I think it's predominantly a two-handed weapon. You might slip the hand sometimes, you might bring it back up like you do with quarterstaffs and other pole weapons. Sometimes you might, chamber up a blow like this and then swing out there, which is a very efficient way of using it and much quicker than just trying to yoink it backwards and forwards holding at the end. So you might slide the hand up and down, but in addition to the obvious whacking element of it, notice the tip of it is quite pointy. Now you've got to bear in mind, in the Solomon Islands, the people using these are not really certainly not wearing any protective gear, and they're most of the time not wearing anything at all. So a thrust from that, and bear in mind this has been a bit rounded and blunted because it's old. I don't know how old, probably 100 plus years old, 150 maybe. If that was more pointy, clearly, bam, getting that in the face would be extremely unpleasant, or most other parts of your body. Now what's interesting is, although you've got the whacking, the swollen, sort of added inertia, falchion-like end to this for cleaving, and you've got a point for jabbing, you've also, interestingly, got a point at the other end. Now I've looked at a few of these online, and you'll notice that the tips here is kind of delineated by these little, not quite barbs, but a sort of bit of carving that shows you that this is almost like a spear tip. Now it could be that they shaped that, because obviously they used arrows and spears as well. It could be that they shaped that to be reminiscent of those heads. However, whatever, it is pointy. which is really, really interesting. Now, you can't really hold the weapon very comfortably. I mean, you can hold it by this end. It becomes a bit like a rifle stock then. So you could theoretically hold it by the back end and stab, but that's not what I think they probably did most of the time. I think that these weapons are predominantly used like this. But because they're not truly edged like a sword is, and because they're not truly pointed like a metal sword is, you've got nothing really to prevent someone from grabbing your weapon or closing in on you. This is the same with quarterstaves and other forms of pole weapon. It's even true of something like a Dane axe. So you have to think about, and it's the same if we look at medieval treatises, what do you do if you're using a spear and a person closes in on you? And we've got in the treatises the solutions for that. So if we go to Fiore, the typical solution to if you're smashing someone and thrusting someone and they charge in and grab your weapon or just basically parry with their own stick and charge in, the obvious thing that you can do at close range is bring the back of the weapon to bear. So if your tip gets pushed aside or blocked, then you flip the weapon around and you've immediately now got this stabbing point at the back end. So essentially the techniques that we would do in longsword, where you strike with the pommel, pommel strikes are usually done like that rather than actually turning the whole weapon around, although we have looked at that in the past. That's not the usual way of using a pommel. A usual way of using a pommel is simply to strike at very, very close range. So this becomes very effective at that. And bear in mind I mentioned slipping the hands. Theoretically, you could lance the point out that way as well. So despite the fact that this is only a stick and a very nice piece of hardwood, I'm not sure what type of hardwood, I tried to find out, but according to the websites, they use various different types of hardwood, but it's a very dark, very dense, I don't even know if this would float actually, it's a bit like some African hardwoods I'm familiar with. It's a very dense and heavy, solid, hard piece of wood. As well as just having that as a hitting thing, it's actually very, very versatile. Okay, so you've basically got edges on both sides. You could flip it around. You could hit with the back side as well. You've got a point at the end there. You've got a point at the end there. It's not just a whacking stick. Just look at this amazing detail here. That is a finely and expertly carved line right the way up to the tip, and the same on both sides. Now if you imagine carving, I don't know how many of you out there have carved wood, bearing in mind that you're probably using some type of fairly primitive scraper, no metal tools, no metal knives. So you're carving this out of a hard piece of wood and reducing it down to the shape you want, but you leave just that beautiful little spine up the center of the blade there. That just shows so much attention, and I think it's worth reiterating, because obviously on this channel we talk about combat and fighting and this kind of stuff. It's worth reiterating that despite the fact that this is a fairly simple piece of wood, well chosen wood and a very nice piece of wood, nevertheless it is expertly carved in a way that I would struggle to do, certainly with primitive tools. So there was an element of status, perhaps even currency to an extent, trading for certain things. You know, a particularly well carved version of one of these might be worth more in trade. You might get more whatever type of vegetable or other object, seashells or whatever, were being traded in return for this. And it's beautifully made. And some of these, so I should also mention, this one is missing any kind of covering on here. Now, my researchers did uncover the fact that many of these, and the most sought after and valuable ones, actually have a braided or woven, shall we say, covering up some of the shaft here. Now interestingly, I'm not completely clear on how much of the shaft on this type are normally covered. I have seen one example where most of the shaft from about there to there was covered in grip, which is very, very interesting, because one thing I noticed when using this is because the edge is relatively edged, it's not that comfortable to use, but I've got 21st century desk jockey hands that are relatively soft. Yeah, okay, I use swords and stuff fairly often, but I don't do a manual labour job. I'm essentially I sit in front of a computer for most of the day. I think someone who was, you know, constantly doing essentially manual labour, hunting and working things, making things, would have much tougher hands. So I don't know that would necessarily bother me, but if that was covered, that would nevertheless get over that element, and it would also to some extent add to your traction and control on the stick, but it might possibly slightly reduce your ability to slide up and down the shaft and use it in these ways that I was talking about. Pluses and minuses, I don't know. But looking at some of the other Solomon Islands and other ethnographically similar or related weapons from the region, some of them only have a covering on the base here, which is interesting because it tells you where they were held. So if, for example, we only had a covering that was, you know, maybe, I don't know, 12 inches down here, that would tell you that they were gripped kind of like a longsword. However, if you've got a covering going all the way up here, well, that tells you that they're using the thing with their hands further apart. Why is that important? Well, because it changes how they're swinging the thing. Because the difference between this and this actually is quite big. Now, clearly I can just slide from there to there, but if they're predominantly using it like this, that would change their method of fighting, the martial art essentially, from something that's a little bit more like quarterstaff, where you might be blocking with the middle of the shaft and using both ends. It's quite like poleaxe. They might be using it more like this. Whereas if they're holding it down here, then they might be using it more like a sword. And those are two methods slightly they're sort of towards the opposite ends of a spectrum. They're not completely separate things, they're related, and obviously a sword, you can half sword with it and this kind of stuff, and a polearm, you don't have to hold it like that, you can swing at the back end, as we've spoken about many times. But nevertheless, I think it's interesting. So, for a simple stick from the Solomon Islands, I think there's a huge amount to say about these things, and they're super, super interesting. But most of all, it's an amazingly fun piece of wood. And bear in mind, in my HEMA class, you know, we're used to handling all sorts of swords and polearms and daggers and all kind of stuff on a week-to-week, well, a couple of times a week basis. The fact that I gave this piece of hardwood to some people and they went, oh, I really like that, it really says something, actually. I think it deserves a lot more credit than it's probably got. So I might be the first relatively mainstream YouTube channel to feature the Solomon Islands War Club. And now you know what it looks like, now you know what it is. If you see one in a junk shop or an antique store, pick one up, because they're really fun to swing around. Great things, and if you get the chance to visit the Solomon Islands, I'm sure it's an absolutely lovely place. Then go there, and they're probably still making them, you can get these from there today. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I'm Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. See you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.